Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my top 45 wide receiver rankings as we approach our upcoming 2025 fantasy football drafts. Now, before we get into today's content, a quick reminder, if you're looking for my thoughts on a specific wide receiver, there are timestamps available down below in the description of the video. While you're down there, if you want to gain an advantage upon your league mates for the remainder of the season, of course, be sure to subscribe to the channel and check out Betr for updated rankings for the remainder of the season every single week. More information down in the description, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But before we do, let's talk about my number one wide receiver going into 2025, a player that I would put in a tier by himself based on his contributions in 2024 and what his potential ceiling of production looks like this upcoming season. From weeks 3 through 18 last season, after of course the first 2 weeks of a warm-up, having not practiced at all throughout training camp of the 2024 season, Ja'Marr Chase dominated, averaging 10.93 targets per game and 21.65 fantasy points per game. That's the second most fantasy points in a half PPR ever scored in a single season in the last 20 years, only second to Cooper Kupp. Again, incredible production across the board, and he is the best wide receiver in not only the NFL, but in fantasy football. And he's the odds-on favorite to claim the number one wide receiver rank for another consecutive season here, even though that hasn't been done on a back-to-back basis in the last decade. If anyone's going to be able to accomplish it, it's Ja'Marr Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals. Number 2, we have Justin Jefferson, who is making progress from his hamstring injury, and as the weeks have progressed, again, he is looking better and better. He's beginning to run routes at practice, and he's getting himself into the mix. Again, we're still some 15 days away from week 1, and of course that Monday Night Football game as they take on the Chicago Bears, and that's the goal, and of course he should be prepared by then. And when we get to that matchup, of course, yes, he's going to have a new quarterback in the form of J.J. McCarthy, but Justin Jefferson has proven that he is quarterback proof, and we have seen that Kevin O'Connell is a quarterback whisperer. So when we go ahead and look at the potential of the 2025 Minnesota Vikings, and I expect them to pass the ball significantly more this upcoming season, because in 2024, they were second amongst all teams in the National Football League in terms of average minutes per game leading against their opponents, 34.5 minutes per game. A ridiculous number, only second to the Detroit Lions last season. So if we're going to lean away from a run-heavy approach, because there's going to be an opportunity for this young quarterback to learn, potentially put themselves into negative or neutral game scripts, it'll lead to more target opportunities for someone like Justin Jefferson, who last season only got himself 9.06 targets per game, which led to 15.65 fantasy points per game. If we're able to jump that number up back to his 2022, 2023 numbers of 11 targets per game, we're potentially in line for 19 plus fantasy points and a half PPR from Justin Jefferson. Number 3, to close out the S tier, is CeeDee Lamb. Very similar to Jefferson. Again, he's quarterback proof based on what he established last season. Whether it was with Dak Prescott or Cooper Rush, he was averaging 14 to 15 fantasy points per game, 10 targets per game, was clearing away an elite wide receiver, all while dealing with a shoulder injury. Had he not got injured in a 17-game pace based on his production last season, he was on pace for 253 plus fantasy points, 180 targets, and over the course of the last 5 fantasy football seasons, anytime a wide receiver has eclipsed 250 fantasy points and a half PPR, they've always been top 6 at the position. I'm anticipating a bounce back season here for CeeDee Lamb, and of course with Dak Prescott being healthy, it's going to allow him to get to the upper levels of potential, considering it just was 2023 when CeeDee Lamb was the number 1 overall wide receiver and finished with 330 plus fantasy points. Okay, let's move on to the next tier, talking about Puka Nacua, who earlier this offseason I did have in my S tier at times, but again, buyer beware because of the Matthew Stafford situation and back injury. But even if Matthew Stafford is going to potentially miss time this season, Jimmy Garoppolo has supported wide receiver ones in his career. When we go back to 2023, Davante Adams and Jakobi Meyers, as members of the Las Vegas Raiders with a healthy Jimmy Garoppolo, were the number 12 and the number 21 overall wide receivers in terms of fantasy points per game on average throughout that span of time while Jimmy Garoppolo was still the starter. In 2022, Garoppolo was able to support Ayuk, Deebo, and Kittle, to being Ayuk and Deebo the number 12 and 20 wide receivers overall, and Kittle as the number 6 overall tight end. So with Puka Nacua obviously coming off of a fantastic season when healthy from weeks 8 through 17, averaging 17.7 fantasy points per game, nearly 11 targets per game, being targeted on 38% of the routes that he ran, which is number 1 amongst all wide receivers in the last 19 seasons of the NFL. Again, we're anticipating, regardless of who's playing quarterback, for Puka Nacua to, of course, continue to maintain his value within the Sean McVay offense. Now, what I wanted to go ahead and do is I wanted to travel on over to Betr and kind of show you guys the potential of this upcoming season for Puka Nacua. So when we go to the full season tab, we go over to players, we go over to the wide receiver position. Again, there are a lot of players in which they currently have plays that you can take advantage of, picking more or less on a given statistic. But we are looking for Puka Nacua, who currently sits at 1,199.5 receiving yards. I'm taking more on that primarily because since 1970, there are only 2 wide receivers that have averaged more yards per game on average in their first 2 seasons than Puka Nacua. Puka Nacua has averaged 95.56 in the last 2 seasons when healthy. OBJ and Justin Jefferson are the only other wide receivers that have averaged more since 1970. I'm anticipating if you're going to be averaging 95 yards per game in your career to be able to continue to find success for another consecutive season. Now, when we continue on, speaking of better, for those of you who want to go ahead, potentially follow the plays I'm going to go ahead and put together on today's episode, be sure to travel down to the description, check out the link, because not only can you follow those plays, but you can go ahead and get my rankings every single week for the remainder of the season. We're talking about draft rankings over the course of the month of August that are updated weekly, sent from my email directly to yours, by position, by tier, half PPR, full PPR at the quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, defense, and flex positions. Additionally, these rankings do not stop during the regular season, as I'll send you weekly rankings every single Sunday morning in order to help you capture a 2025 Fantasy Football Championship. Check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility based on your current location. All you have to do, again, is sign up using code Andrew, make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, make a first-time play within the Betr Picks section, minimum of $1, and you'll be instantly on my email list, and go ahead and get those emails for the remainder of the season. And if you play up to $10 today, you'll get up to $30 instantly via Betr. Take advantage of the generous offer. Thank you very much for all the support. All right, let's continue on with the next wide receiver I wanted to mention, the thumbnail of today's episode. We have Malik Nabers, who led all wide receivers last season, or led all players last season in fantasy football in terms of targets per game when healthy, 11.33, which led to 14.61 fantasy points per game. But going into this upcoming season, I've moved them up my rankings because I've seen what the potential of Malik Nabers alongside of Russell Wilson, Jameis Winston, and even Jackson Dart is going to look like, and it's promising. And considering we're getting an improvement at the quarterback position in comparison to what Malik Nabers had to deal with last season at the quarterback position, when we take into account that Russell Wilson amongst all quarterbacks last season was the 3rd best in terms of his accuracy rate. And when we take into account that we're anticipating Malik Nabers to find himself even more fantasy point production this upcoming season based on the history of early success at the wide receiver position. When we talk about 2020 to 2023, first round selected wide receivers, there were 21 total. 15 of them had healthy rookie seasons. 13 of those 15, so 87%, had an improvement in their second season in terms of fantasy point per game on average. Of course, Malik Nabers, a former LSU wide receiver, will be following in the footsteps of 2 wide receivers I've already mentioned today, that being Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson, former LSU wide receivers, as they continue on the streak of success. I mean, LSU has really become, the wide receiver university as of late. All right, moving on to our number 6. We have Amon-Ra St. Brown, who in back-to-back seasons has been the number 3 overall wide receiver because he has stayed healthy and he has stayed consistent. And even though this most recent season only averaged 8.3 targets per game, was still able to average over 15 fantasy points per game because of the incredibly high volume of receiving touchdowns he was able to accumulate. He scored 12 touchdowns last season, which we are still expecting him to regress from. But even in regression, based on how this offense is most likely going to be in more balanced game scripts, again, amongst all teams last season, they were leading more minutes per game than any other team in the National Football League. So again, they ran the ball a bunch. So if we're going to be in a situation in which we're passing the ball more, potentially more opportunities for Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jameson Williams, Laporta, who are all competing against one another for receiving upside. Again, even though he may see regression in terms of the touchdown category, targets may go up. And of course, he is still the number 1 receiving option of an elite offense in the National Football League. Number 7 is Nico Collins, who last season went healthy from weeks 1 through 20. So getting all of his healthy potential games, even including the NFL playoffs, because again, he did miss some time, so we wanted to get a wider scale of his production, averaging 9.18 targets per game and 15.85 fantasy points per game in a half PPR. Amongst all wide receivers in the National Football League and in fantasy football over the course of the last 2 seasons, he's number 1 in terms of fantasy points per route run, with nearly 0.6 average. Ridiculous number. Now you get a new offensive coordinator in Nick Caley, who comes from the Sean McVay coaching tree. Again, Sean McVay coaching tree producing guys like Zach Taylor, Matt LaFleur, Kevin O'Connell, Zach Robinson, Liam Cohen. The wide receivers associated with those offenses in 2024 consisting of Puka, Chase, Jefferson, London, Godwin, and Evans. When we throw Nico Collins and his talent level already into the mix, and with that kind of a scheme, we're anticipating potential number 1 overall upside for a player of his caliber if he can stay healthy. The final player within this tier, we have Brian Thomas Jr., who again is associated now with Liam Cohen. Like I just mentioned moments ago, when you get a former, coach of the Los Angeles Rams or someone from the Sean McVay coaching tree, there's even more potential for upside, because not only was Liam Cohen highly efficient in his time with the Rams in 2022, but last season was able to elevate the Buccaneers to incredible levels. And going into this upcoming season, we have heard Liam Cohen specifically say that Brian Thomas Jr. is going to be the entire passing game. The offense will run through him. And based on what we have seen from Cohen's offenses, going back to 2022, Cooper Kupp was averaging 20.31 fantasy points per game prior to his injury. Last season, Godwin averaging 16.11 fantasy points per game prior to his injury. When we take into account that Brian Thomas Jr. in the preseason has been playing about 43% of his overall snaps from the slot position, and last season scored 44% of his fantasy points from the slot position, having only played 28% of his snaps from the slot. If he's going to get more exposure within those opportunities, expect a lot more potential for upside in year 2, where he and Malik Nabers, as these first-round wide receivers, are going to continue to take steps forward in terms of their fantasy point per game averages increasing once again. Number 9, we have Drake London, who last season with Kirk Cousins was still a wide receiver 1, averaging 12.53 fantasy points per game on 9 targets per game. But once Michael Penix Jr. came in, from week 16 through 18, the final 3 games of the season, this Atlanta Falcons team began to average 30 points per game, and Drake London was, of course, a huge part of that, averaging 13 targets and 19.4 fantasy points per game, was able to eclipse 100 receiving yards twice with Michael Penix in just 3 games, while he was only able to accomplish that once with Kirk Cousins throughout weeks 1 through 15. So now that we approach the 2025 season with Michael Penix throughout this entirety of the training camp, that rapport continuing to build, on top of the fact that already last season in the 3 games in which they played together, Drake London was commanding a nearly 40% target share within the offense. I would anticipate Penix to take steps forward, improve as a player, and of course elevate Drake London in doing so. AJ Brown's our number 10. Close to fully returning from the current injury that he's dealing with. Of course, he even was dealing with injuries last season, but despite the fact that he even missed time last year, was fantastic once he returned, averaging 14.9 fantasy points per game on only 7.75 targets per game. And even though that's the lowest target per game average he has seen since joining the Eagles in 2022, we're anticipating a less effective Saquon Barkley, and essentially we should see more passing attempts towards the weapons of this offense, number 1 being AJ Brown, who over the course of his 2024 season was averaging 1.92 fantasy points per target. If we're able to increase his 7.75 targets per game to about 9 targets per game, we're going to potentially see 17 plus fantasy points per week, especially when we take into account that in the 4 games in which AJ Brown was targeted 9 or more times last season, was able to score over 19.7 fantasy points in each of those 4 contests. He's got a lot of upside, just needs the opportunity to achieve it. Number 11 is Ladd McConkey. Now, like many other wide receivers in their rookie season, it takes a little while to finally find your stride. And Ladd McConkey found that stride from weeks 11 through 19, averaging 9 targets per game and 17.3 fantasy points per game. Throughout the entirety of the 2024 season, was top 5 in every single slot receiving usage statistic in terms of targets, receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns. Was able to surpass all of the watermarks that Keenan Allen had established the year prior as the primary receiving option of this offense. And speaking of Keenan Allen, yes, he is rejoining the Chargers, but that's there to potentially help grow Ladd McConkey. And even if we may see some sprinkles of Keenan Allen from the slot position, we witnessed last season that Ladd McConkey had a higher yards per route run average actually playing on the outside. So it doesn't matter where you line him up, he is still going to be the number 1 receiving option. And of course, he's going to continue to take strides forward to improving his fantasy point per game average as the primary option of this Los Angeles Chargers offense. Our number 12 is Jaxon Smith-Njigba, who last season, when healthy, was averaging 8.06 targets per game and 11.94 fantasy points per game. Now, even though these numbers don't look incredible, again, a lot of it is because he was competing for targets. I mean, there were 7 games last season where he had 6 or fewer targets because DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett were still in the mix. And despite this fact, he was still able to accumulate 100 total receptions. But now that you go into 2025 with JSN being the number 1 receiving option and getting more targets per game and being the security blanket of Sam Darnold going into this upcoming season, from what we saw last year in the 2 games in which JSN played without DK Metcalf, averaging 10 targets per game, there could easily be a possibility in which JSN's able to put together a season in which he's getting, instead of 8 targets per game, 10 targets per game on average, easily able to surpass 100 receptions and be a PPR machine for many of our rosters. Number 13 to close out this tier is Tyreek Hill. Look, prior to 2024, he had ranked as a top 6 fantasy wide receiver for 4 consecutive seasons. In the 2022 and 2023 seasons with the Dolphins, averaging about 19 to 20 points per game. And unfortunately, this most recent season, only averaging 13 points per game. Tua went down with injury, and Tyreek Hill was dealing with his own wrist injury. And we're hoping that he can get back to his levels of opportunity share that he saw back in 2023, where again, he was averaging 10 targets per game in comparison to nearly 8 per game with Tua. If we're able to give him opportunities, one of the fastest wide receivers in the league, a potential future Hall of Famer, there is still a lot of upside, associated with him going into this upcoming season, and the implied risk that is also involved is already baked in based on his current ADP going into this upcoming season. So it is worth the selection within our upcoming third rounds. Number 14, speaking of a third round potential selection, we have Mike Evans, who's coming off of 11 consecutive years of 1,000 receiving yards. He has been a top 10 fantasy ranked wide receiver in 4 of the last 5 seasons. And even though he is coming off of a season in which he averaged 15.22 fantasy points per game when healthy, and even though he has been eligible and played 168 of his last 180 regular season games, and even though he has scored 105 receiving touchdowns in the last 168 healthy games he has played, I still have him as my number 14. I don't expect him to get into that top 10 conversation because as long as these other receivers that I've already mentioned stay healthy, they should score more points per game than him. And even with Godwin potentially missing the first month or 2 months of the season and Jalen McMillan also missing significant time, I still anticipate Mike Evans to dominate for another consecutive season here. And when we travel on over to Betr and go and look at the potential of Mike Evans, let's see where we can find Mike Evans here. Ricky Pearsall, I like that number. Egbuka, we have Evans here at 959.5 receiving yards. I'll take the potential in which he's able to surpass 1,000 receiving yards, especially considering all the injuries that have taken place within this offense, potentially more negative game scripts, throwing the ball even more targets in his direction. I expect Mike Evans to continue to dominate and, of course, have himself another fantastic year as another one of these future Hall of Fame wide receivers that are in the top 15 of my rankings. All right, now before we continue, again, for those of you guys who want my rankings for the remainder of the season, again, all you got to do is check out Betr, potentially go ahead and make those plays, picking more or less on given players. All you have to do is travel down below to the description of the video, click on the link, use code ANGE today, make that first-time deposit minimum of $10, and make a first-time play minimum of $1 within the Betr Picks section, and I'll send you those rankings every single week for the remainder of the season. Over the course of the month of August, weekly updated rankings for both half PPR, full PPR, all-encompassing rankings for all singular positions and the flex position. And of course, the same every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season. So for those of you interested, check out the link down below. Thank you very much for all the support. All right, continuing on, we have T. Higgins as our number 15. Look, T. Higgins has not been able to rank higher than the number 17 overall wide receiver in his career. In fact, in his 3 healthy seasons, finished as wide receiver 22, 17, and 17. And that's primarily because he has missed 15 games due to injury since 2021. And if he can stay healthy going into this upcoming season, the number 15 overall spot is a guarantee. But again, he has had injury risk and potential every single season of his career. And even this training camp, he had a little bit of a couple scares. But what he was able to accomplish late last season from weeks 11 through 18, post-injury, 9 targets per game and 17 fantasy points per game. If he's able to string that across 15 to 17 games this upcoming season, a top 12 ranking is a guarantee considering the offense he's associated with and, of course, his level of potential. Number 16, we have Davante Adams. In the same vein in which we spoke about Puka Nacua and his potential risk involved, when we're talking about the number 2 receiving option of the Rams offense, again, there's even more implied risk because if in fact Jimmy Garoppolo is in the mix, the number 2 receiving option that we have seen Jimmy Garoppolo be able to support over the course of the 2022 and 2023 seasons has been Jakobi Meyers and Deebo Samuel. They're ranked as number 21 and 20 in those respective seasons in terms of fantasy points per game on average, which again, if we were to get Davante Adams as the number 2 receiving option of this offense with Jimmy G as a top 20 option, we'll take it. So imagine what he's going to be able to potentially accomplish with a guy like Matthew Stafford. I think number 16 is a soft ranking because again, of the implied risk. So we have to meet in the middle rather than put him at number 12. I leave him here at 16. And the primary reason being that Davante Adams just really isn't slowing down in his career. Last season, from weeks 9 through 18 with Aaron Rodgers, 11 targets per game and 16.78 fantasy points per game and half PPR. This is a wide receiver that has been top 10 in terms of fantasy points per game on average at the position in 6 of the last 7 seasons. He's a dominant force and is going to continue to ball out this upcoming season. Number 17, we have DK Metcalf. Speaking of playing with Aaron Rodgers, Again, when we talk about the number one receiving option of Aaron Rodgers, and when we talk about the fact that just moments ago I mentioned that Davante Adams from weeks 9 through 18 of last season was averaging 11 targets per game and 16.78 fantasy points per game, I'm anticipating DK Metcalf to have that level of opportunity share, because even Garrett Wilson from weeks 1 through 6 prior to the arrival of Davante Adams last season was averaging 11 targets per game and 16.2 fantasy points per game. When we look at the history of Aaron Rodgers' number one receiving option since 2008, those wide receivers are averaging 89 receptions, 1,200 yards, 10 receiving touchdowns per season across the board. DK Metcalf has wide receiver one top 12 pedigree. He was able to accomplish it with Russell Wilson in 2020 and in 2021. So why not this upcoming season as the number one receiving option of an Aaron Rodgers-led offense? Number 18, we have Courtland Sutton, who again last season from weeks 8 through 19 was a dominant force because of Bo Nix's ascension as a quarterback, averaging 8.8 targets per game and 14.5 fantasy points per game. And throughout that span of time, getting himself a 25% target percentage in terms of the targets per route run. He was able to get himself a 2.29 yards per route run average and was number 2 amongst all wide receivers in terms of air yards from weeks 8 through 18 of the 2024 season. When we're talking about air yards in the deep receiving game, again, he was number 3 in receptions, number 9 in receiving yards, and number 5 in receiving touchdowns, 20 or more yards down the field. When he's the number 1 receiving threat, when he's the number 1 red zone option, when he's the number 1 touchdown option for this offense, and this offense is continuing to ascend with Bo Nix taking steps forward, anticipate Courtland Sutton to continue his successful streak of games. Number 19, we have DJ Moore, who again, last season in the post-Shane Waldron era, once they fired their OC, continued to get himself ample opportunity. In fact, was able to put together a string of 8 games in which he had no less than 7 targets every game and no less than 6 receptions in every game, which led to a 13.7 fantasy point per game average. Going into this upcoming season with Ben Johnson, who should elevate the offense, who should elevate Caleb Williams as a quarterback, that means that the number 1 receiving option of the Chicago Bears, DJ Moore, should ascend as well. And what he was able to accomplish last season landed him being the number 16 overall wide receiver. Even though I have him at number 19, it's because I do anticipate a lot of upside under the assumption that everybody stays healthy in the conversation I've already established thus far. But considering Ben Johnson steps into the conversation, we have seen DJ Moore get himself a lot of design plays in his direction. Screen passes, bubble screens, lining up in the backfield, taking zone read options, motion sweeps, everything. They're putting him in movement and they're getting him open on a consistent basis, and that's what's going to happen here in 2025. Number 20, we have Marvin Harrison Jr., who again, last season from weeks 13 through 18, the Arizona Cardinals coaching staff specifically came out and said that they want to get him more opportunities, and that's exactly what happened. Was able to get himself 8.33 targets per game, which on a 17-game pace is 142 targets. 142 targets would have been number 8 amongst all wide receiver options in 2024. With more opportunity comes more potential for success in fantasy football. And in the case of a wide receiver like Marvin Harrison, who is a top 10 selected wide receiver in 2024, and we have seen the history of wide receivers selected that early have an incredibly high percentage of chance of developing and becoming a top 24 option in their next season. I mean, we're expecting Marvin Harrison to immediately be able to get himself into the top 24 conversation. I leave him at 20 because I'm hoping that, again, Kyler Murray is going to put a little bit more effort into getting him the ball as Marvin Harrison has taken steps forward this offseason to improving himself as a receiver and, of course, a pro, considering how much muscle he's put on his frame. Number 21, we have Garrett Wilson. So from weeks 1 through 9 of last season, prior to the Davante Adams complete takeover, again, 10 targets per game, 14 fantasy points per game, and we're hoping for very similar opportunity share, but this could be an offense for the Jets where they're throwing the ball maybe 20, 25 times per game and running the ball potentially 40 times a game. If that's going to take place, then of course, Garrett Wilson is going to be a lesser option, but he should still be able to get his 8 to 10 targets per game. I think that should be in line. And if he's able to accomplish that, again, we have seen Justin Fields and Garrett Wilson play together before at Ohio State in 2019 and 2020. We have seen Justin Fields support a wide receiver in the form of DJ Moore to average 16.81 fantasy points per game when they were playing healthy together in 2023. I understand that Garrett Wilson has been a solid wide receiver his entire career. I don't believe in the idea of drafting him in the 3rd round of this year's upcoming drafts, but I still do believe he's capable of 1,000+ receiving yards in this current iteration of the Jets offense. Number 22, we have Tetairoa McMillan, who should clear and away be the number 1 target getter of this offense and was drafted in the top 10 of the 2025 NFL draft to be able to exactly do that, be the number 1 target getter, and of course, elevate this offense as a whole. And when we talk about number 1 target getters that were 1st round selected rookie wide receivers over the course of 2020 to 2024, those wide receivers on average scored 11.18 fantasy points per game. That's on average. That's not the upside potential of Tetairoa McMillan, who I truly do believe is going to be a fantastic fantasy option, considering Dave Canales, the primary play caller of this offense, has already come out and said he's going to be targeted a lot. We're going to throw a lot in his direction, and he is pretty much going to be utilized as the Mike Evans of this offense, because of course Dave Canales back in 2023 was the OC of that Tampa Bay Buccaneers team. And of course, Mike Evans, when healthy, 1,400 yards, 14 touchdowns, 87 receptions. I understand McMillan isn't at the caliber of what Mike Evans currently stands at, but he certainly has the chance to grow in that direction, of course, develop over the season and be a dominant top 24 option. 23 is Terry McLaurin. This is another one of these buyer bewares because, again, we don't know what the situation entails and what it potentially holds. I'm expecting that he is going to play. I'm expecting they're going to ink him with a new contract in the coming weeks here. If they don't do so, they're making a terrible mistake. But again, if Terry McLaurin returns, he's ready to go, and he's the number one option. I would rank him a little bit higher than this. I'd probably put him at number 19 in comparison to the number 23 spot, because again, even though he only averaged 7.11 targets per game last season, 14.8 fantasy points per game. And though we may anticipate to see regression in terms of the receiving touchdown category, considering you're bringing in guys like Deebo Samuel, I would still anticipate a guy like Terry McLaurin to get himself a lot of opportunity share in this offense that is going to be scoring many of points this season. Number 24 is Xavier Worthy. Look, it took him until week 11 to break out, but once he broke out, was averaging 14.64 fantasy points per game on 7.6 targets per game. I think that target share opportunity of 7 to 8 targets per game is still going to be permanent, whether or not we do see Rashee Rice on the field. Because what Rashee Rice is going to impact is Travis Kelce's overall potential for upside within the target range. So when we have Xavier Worthy that is getting himself the design plays in terms of bubble screens, rushing attempts, and then the deep ball, all of that is going to be contributing to the potential for his, 13 to 14, 15 fantasy points that he certainly is capable of accomplishing. Again, last season, in 11 of the 19 games in which he had 5 or more touches, 13.67 fantasy points per game. He recorded the fastest 40-yard dash speed in NFL Combine history, so why not continue to throw the ball deep in his direction every single week, at least maybe 2 to 3 times, to give him an opportunity and give him a chance at that upside. 25 is Calvin Ridley. Look, the lack of talent at the quarterback position for the Tennessee Titans last season was the reason why Calvin Ridley struggled. Otherwise, the opportunity share, when it was finally there from weeks 8 through 17, he averaged nearly 12 fantasy points per game. And there was still so much unrealized potential for upside, considering he was number one amongst all receivers in terms of total air yards in the National Football League, was able to garner a 16.0 average depth of target. Again, he's a deep receiving option that now gets a solid quarterback, the number one overall selection of the 2025 NFL Draft. And from what we have seen over the course of the last 2 seasons, top-tier selected quarterbacks that came in and immediately started in the form of Caleb Williams, Jaden Daniels, Bo Nix, Bryce Young, and CJ Stroud, they were all able to elevate their primary number one wide receiver to being top 25 within that given season, whether it was Nico Collins, Adam Thielen, Sutton, McLaurin, or DJ Moore. Therefore, I think Calvin Ridley perfectly fits here as our number 25 with the potential of even growing beyond this season, depending on how well Cam Ward plays. Ricky Pearsall is our number 26. Look, the 49ers offense has had a top 25 ranked wide receiver in each of the last 4 seasons, 2021, 2022, 2023, and 2024. That being Ayuk, Deebo, or Jennings. So with this upcoming season almost upon us, and that competition of Ayuk, Deebo, and Jennings not really looking like much competition anymore, as Ayuk is out and is not going to play for quite a considerable amount of time, considering he's still recovering from the ACL. Deebo Samuel is now playing for the Washington Commanders, and Jennings is still dealing with a calf injury. Demarcus Robinson just got suspended for the first 3 games of the season. I think Ricky Pearsall is immediately going to make an impact, and he's clear and away going to be the number one wide receiver of this offense and garner the most targets. And from what we saw late last season in the final 2 games of his 2024 campaign, putting up 24.7 and 15.9 half PPR fantasy points, when we go ahead and travel on over to Betr and we look at the current number of one Ricky Pearsall being 80.5 receiving yards, I will take the 3 players that I've mentioned thus far, Puka, Evans, and Pearsall, to all be able to surpass their current, statistical base here on Betr. We're taking more on all 3. I'm going to go ahead and place this entry going into this upcoming season because I truly do believe Ricky Pearsall, with very little competition surrounding him, should be able to dominate. And if you're playing on like a sleeper format, guys, the potential ADP he sits at, it grants so much of a discount, especially if people in your league aren't consistently looking at a specific draft sheet to know where players are ranked. Again, if you want my draft sheet, check out Betr, use code Andrew. But if they're not looking at it, my goodness, it's going to give you an advantage to grab him far later in drafts in comparison to where I've had to select him in our most recent mock drafts in our live streams. Number 27 is Jameson Williams, who last season averaged 12.23 fantasy points per game when healthy. And this offseason, the coaching staff has specifically come out and said that they're going to continue to get him more opportunities, and he is taking steps forward. And the Lions continue to hint this offseason that they're going to be throwing the ball deep down the field. And if we're going to give opportunities for someone like Jameson Williams, who is a burner on the outside, who's able to make his singular fantasy week performance off of one singular play, again, this is an opportunity in which you can draft a wide receiver to be your wide receiver 3 or your flex that is going to be able to score you a boatload of points. And in the opportunities in games in which he scores touchdowns, be that, week winning decider as to whether or not you capture the victory. I mean, last season, he scored touchdowns of 52, 70, 37, 64, 82, 42, and 61 yards. Again, he's a guy that if you get the ball into his hands, he's going to make some magical things happen. Number 28, very similar to Jameson Williams, I expect George Pickens to have this exact role of being the deep, receiving option of the Dallas Cowboys offense. And luckily for George Pickens, besides the fact that he was top 10 in all receiving categories, 20 or more yards down the field last season, and luckily for him, Dak Prescott was top 5 in all those passing categories in 2023. So now that he gets an opportunity to play with the best quarterback he's ever played with in his career, and the last 2 full healthy seasons of Dak Prescott has consisted of 4,400 passing yards and 36 plus passing touchdowns, we may be in a position in which George Pickens, who last season with Russell Wilson was averaging 11.67 fantasy points per game, could take even further steps forward, averaging 13, 14 points per game, and could very easily get himself in the top 20 conversation, depending on how well this Dallas Cowboys offense functions and how well Dak Prescott is able to elevate him at the position. Number 29 is DeVonta Smith, who last season averaged 12.72 fantasy points per game when healthy. Obviously, we all know that A.J. Brown is currently dealing with an injury. And the reason why I wanted to specifically mention that is because in games in which we have seen DeVonta Smith play without A.J. Brown, specifically last year, 3 total games, was averaging 8.7 targets and 15.07 fantasy points per game. So if in fact we do see A.J. Brown miss some time, of course, DeVonta Smith immediately becomes a wide receiver 1. And in those instances, of course, dominates, but also has even more potential for upside if this offense leans away from running the ball and they continue to have to air it out. If this takes place, of course, DeVonta Smith is going to have even more value. A player that last season, of course, averaged the most fantasy points per game of his entire career over the course of the last 3 seasons, because again, he had 9 of his 13 games consisting of double-digit fantasy points, which is very promising going into this upcoming season. Number 30, we have Zay Flowers, who again, in the last 2 seasons has ranked as the number 30 and 24 wide receiver. The only thing that really holds back Zay Flowers is touchdown upside. Even though he accumulated 26% of the target share and 26% of the yard share of the Baltimore Ravens offense last season, he only consisted of scoring about 10% of their touchdown share through the air. Again, only 10% of the 41 touchdowns, 4 receiving touchdowns isn't going to cut it for someone like Zay Flowers. If he's able to keep that target share, that yardage share, and elevate the touchdown conversation to potentially 6 to 8 touchdowns, he's easily in the top 24 conversation. Again, touchdowns are the name of the game when we're talking about potential for upside. 31 is Rome Odunze. Going into year 1, we all anticipated for him to struggle because, again, he did have DJ Moore and Keenan Allen within that offense. Now that you approach this upcoming season, and you have the potential of a former top 10 selected NFL wide receiver within his NFL draft in the mix with a new offensive coordinator that could give him the Jameson Williams boost in year 2 here, there's a possibility in which Rome Odunze, very similar to other wide receivers that were selected within the top 10 of the position since 2020. I mean, we're talking about Jamar Chase, Jaylen Waddle, Drake London, and DeVonta Smith, who all took fantasy point improvements in year 2. The only wide receiver that wasn't able to accomplish it was Garrett Wilson because he had Zach Wilson. But Rome Odunze has Caleb Williams, and I expect both of them to take strides forward this upcoming season. And of course, get him into the range of hopefully scoring 10 plus fantasy points, maybe 11, 12 points per game within this offense. Rashee Rice is my number 32, primarily because, again, Rashee Rice last season, we all know was incredible. 17.63 fantasy points per game from weeks 1 through 3. And even in the final, stretch of games in 2023, his rookie season, from weeks 7 through 17, 12.63 fantasy points per game. The expectation is a 6-game suspension. So if he's going to only be playing 7 games between weeks 1 through 14, he's only going to help your roster with 7 games of production throughout that span of time that help you get into the fantasy playoffs. If you're playing in a league in which only 6 teams out of 12 make the playoffs, then at that point, he may be someone that we're passing on at this range. But if you're playing in a league where you have 12 teams, 8 teams make the playoffs, he's far more of a digestible investment because if he comes out And for those 7 games, averages 17 fantasy points per game and gets you to the playoffs, and he continues that streak of success from weeks 15 through 17, he'll win you a championship. Number 33 is Jaylen Waddle, who again has proven in the past that he can be a top 12 wide receiver. He just needs to be healthy, he needs Tua to be healthy, and he needs opportunity share. And I truly do believe that all of that is capable in 2025. It truly is. Just need Jaylen Waddle to see far more targets than 5.88 per game. And with the absence of Jonnu Smith and Darren Waller, of course, not being in the mix as of yet, and Tyreek Hill taking steps back in his career, hopefully we can launch Jaylen Waddle to getting to that 8 target per game average, because if we can, he certainly will outrank the number 33 spot, considering how talented of a receiver he is and what he has been able to show within this Mike McDaniel offense that has pretty much given these wide receivers the ability to catch the ball and make plays after the catch on a consistent enough basis to being top 24 players. Number 34 is Jakobi Meyers. He's ranked as the number 33, 28, 24, and 23 wide receiver in the last 4 seasons. Now you get an upgrade with Geno Smith, who has been able to support 2 top 33 wide receivers in each of the last 3 seasons as a member of the Seattle Seahawks. Whether it was JSN Metcalf and Lockett or Metcalf, it doesn't matter. Whatever year, every single season, at least 2 top 33 receiving options. Now that you approach this upcoming year, I understand that Jakobi Meyers was averaging 12 fantasy points per game last season, but that was on 9.33 targets per game. I don't expect him to get 9.33 targets per game. I expect a decrease based on Bowers' overall usage share, and of course this offense leaning towards a more run-heavy approach, and of course more target competition. Therefore, 34 seems like a safe spot for him. Number 35 is Travis Hunter. When we talk about from 2020 to 2024, wide receivers that were selected in the top 10 of their NFL draft, there have been 8 total that have had full healthy rookie seasons, playing 15 or more games. 7 of those 8 wide receivers ranked within the top 36. It's an 88% success rate pretty much. So if we're going to be in a position in which we do see Travis Hunter follow in the footsteps, the average production of those wide receivers that were able to claim top 36 upside were 80 receptions, over 1,000 yards, and 6 touchdowns. I have said this offseason that I'm anticipating to see a Marvin Harrison Jr.-esque season for Travis Hunter, because he's going to be the number 2 receiving option of his offense, just in the same way in which Marvin Harrison was last season. So because Travis Hunter is going to have to, of course, play second fiddle to Brian Thomas Jr., I would anticipate 800 yards, 8 touchdowns to be in the realm of possibility for him and rank him within the top 36 this upcoming season. And if he does play more wide receiver this upcoming season than we currently anticipate, and it does lead to less opportunity share within the receiving category, number 35 is safe. Number 36, Emeka Egbuka, another one of these rookie first-round selected wide receivers that, again, is joining an offense that, again, is elite. We're averaging 29 points per game as a team last season. Chris Godwin was incredible prior to his injury last season, averaging 16-plus fantasy points per game. Jalen McMillan last season, in the absence of Chris Godwin, was averaging 17 fantasy points per game from weeks 14 through 18, and both of those receivers are going to miss significant time. So outside of Mike Evans and Cade Otton, Emeka Egbuka should be the number 2 target getter of this offense. And when we talk about first-round selected rookie wide receivers in the last 5 seasons that were the number 2 target getters in a full healthy rookie year, we're talking about 110 targets and potentially 173 fantasy points in that season, which would significantly outpace the number 36 ranking. But then we continue on with another rookie wide receiver that, again, I believe has a lot of upside. It's Matthew Golden, who, whether he's the number 1 receiving option of the Packers from week 1 on or from potentially weeks 4 on, it doesn't matter. He's eventually going to be the number 1. And what we have seen from over the course of the last 2 seasons of Jayden Reed being the number 1 wide receiver of this offense, there's a lot of value to be had. Therefore, we're anticipating him over a 17-game pace based on the history of success of other first-round selected rookie wide receivers that are number 1 target getter of their offense to be able to handle 130-plus targets and over 190 fantasy points. So why do I have him at number 37? Because, again, it may take some time for him to be able to ascend to that level. He may not just jump into the role of a Malik Nabers immediately and get 11 targets per game based on what we have witnessed from a Matt LaFleur offense and how the Green Bay Packers have functioned over the course of the last couple seasons. We continue on to our number 38, who, again, should be able to outscore this position based on what he proved last season. With Jameis Winston was averaging over 17 fantasy points per game. There's a reason why in a full PPR, he finished as wide receiver 12. So when we approach this upcoming season with Joe Flacco as his quarterback, and from what we have seen with Joe Flacco supporting Amari Cooper as a member of the Browns to averaging 20.28 fantasy points per game in the final stretch of the season, and even if we go back to the 2024 Colts with Joe Flacco, in weeks 4, 5, 6, 9, 10, 17, and 18, When Joe Flacco was a starting quarterback, we had Alec Pierce averaging 11.13 fantasy points per game. Josh Downs averaging 11.91 fantasy points per game. Michael Pittman Jr. averaging 11.83 fantasy points per game. Joe Flacco, when the season begins, is going to be able to support Judy, David Njoku, and Cedric Tillman. They're all going to be relevant to begin the year. But then once Flacco disappears, can the backup quarterbacks sustain that potential for upside? I don't think so. Therefore, Judy sits at 38. All right, continuing on, we have our number 39. It is Deebo Samuel. The way that I see it, if Terry McLaurin does not return Deebo Samuel as the number one receiving option of this offense, the fact that McLaurin scored 13 touchdowns last season, again, there is so much more potential for upside for Deebo in the event in which McLaurin doesn't return because Brian Robinson Jr. just got traded. And Deebo Samuel, we all know, is a rushing threat. He could line up at running back. He could be the starting running back of this team. Who knows? But as of right now, I think number 39 is a safe spot because I do anticipate and I do assume Terry McLaurin will eventually return here to, of course, be the number one option of the Washington Commanders offense. Number 40, we have Chris Olave, who, like I mentioned already this offseason, when healthy, has ranked as the number 25 and the number 19 wide receiver in 2022 and 2023. The Saints offense is likely going to have a bunch of negative game scripts all season long. So as long as the number one receiving option of the Saints offense can stay healthy and, of course, avoid concussion risk, I anticipate that Chris Olave could very easily be a solid fantasy force of 9 to potentially 11 fantasy points per game because, again, the lesser quarterback play that he's associated with. Jordan Addison is our number 41. Going to be suspended for the first 3 games of the season. Yes, he did nearly average 13 fantasy points per game last season, but that's because the Minnesota Vikings were heavily leaning towards a wide receiver attack. This offseason, of course, with the anticipation of an Addison suspension and with the injury to Justin Jefferson and all the other wide receivers within this team, this is probably going to be an offense that turns back to heavily supporting the tight end position and getting more utilization out of TJ Hawkinson, which will lead Jordan Addison to being the number 3 receiving option of this offense. But we have seen still being the number 3 receiving option of a Kevin O'Connell offense to be beneficial for fantasy purposes. Number 42 is Stefon Diggs, who's coming off of the quickest ACL recovery of all time. Prior to his injury last season, was averaging 12.6 fantasy points per game as a member of the Houston Texans, primarily playing out of the slot position. So whether he does want to play out of the slot or out wide, or whether Josh McDaniels schemes him up in various different positions, we have seen Josh McDaniels elevate wide receivers. Back in 2022, Davante Adams, 180 targets, 285 fantasy points. 2021, as a member of the New England Patriots, Jakobi Meyers, 126 targets, 145 fantasy points. A lot of potential as long as Stefon Diggs is healthy, and he's the number 1 receiving option of Drake May. Should be solid. Number 43 is Khalil Shakir, who again is currently dealing with a high ankle sprain, and hopefully he's going to be able to return at a full healthy rate because last season he was the number 1 receiving option of this offense. 7 targets per game, 10 fantasy points per game. And amongst all wide receivers last season with a minimum of 30 targets, over the course of the entirety of the regular season, he was number 5 in terms of catch rate with an 80%, and number 5 in terms of yak per reception, yards after the catch per reception. He's a PPR machine that gets more love in a PPR rather than a half PPR. Therefore, we put him at 43, coming off of the injury. But had he stayed healthy last season for the entirety of the year, was on pace to finishing as the number 27 wide receiver in a half PPR. The final 2 options begins with Michael Pittman Jr., who in the 6 games in which he played healthy with Joe Flacco, was averaging 11.83 fantasy points per game. Hopefully Daniel Jones can come in and elevate him to that level because, again, Daniel Jones has been able to support wide receivers. You go back to last season, Malik Nabers and Wan'Dale Robinson to begin the season were both incredibly relevant receiving options. Nabers averaging 11.75 targets per game from weeks 1 through 10 with Daniel Jones and 13.63 fantasy points per game. Sure, Michael Pittman Jr. isn't at the caliber of Nabers, but if he can still score potentially 9 to 10 points per game, it's not out of the realm of possibility that he could even climb further beyond this if touchdowns are within his score lines this season. Final player I wanted to mention, speaking of touchdowns in your score lines, that's going to be the entire game for Keon Coleman. He needs to score like 8 touchdowns this season to finish within this conversation because obviously the opportunity share of targets within the role that he is currently within is not enough. Last season, prior to the injury, weeks 1 through 9, 4 targets per game, but 8 fantasy points per game. Again, when you're getting 2 fantasy points per target, that is a lot of value. So if you could increase those numbers and very similarly see a Gabriel Davis-esque ascension like we saw from 2020 to 2022 within this offense from Gabriel Davis, there's a very high likelihood that we could see Keon Coleman getting himself into a top 36 standing in a weekly ranking every single week because of the touchdown upside that is associated within this offense and the lack of competition that revolves around the wide receiver position. All right, that's going to cover it in regards to my top 45 wide receiver rankings. Before we close out again, for those of you guys who want my all-encompassing rankings, you can head on over and find my 2025 fantasy football draft guide via the Patreon, link down in the description. Not only will the subscription give you access to the 2025 draft guide, of course, the updated rankings over the course of the season. You can ask me unlimited questions, get Discord community server access that, again, is privated. So if you guys are interested, go ahead and take advantage of the opportunity. Or, of course, you can go ahead, check out the link down below. Check out Betr. Use code Andrew. Make that first-time deposit minimum of $10. That first-time play minimum of $1 within the Betr Picks section. And get those subsequent rankings for the remainder of the season. You won't get the draft guide, but you'll get the rankings going forward. All right, that's going to cover it for me. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And until tomorrow, I'll see you guys. Peace.